In the deepest vault of the Vatican, sealed behind walls that have never been officially acknowledged, there exists a manuscript so ancient and so carefully guarded that its very existence remains a whispered rumor among the highest echelons of religious authority. The document speaks of a covenant made before the foundation of the world, a sacred agreement between the divine feminine and humanity itself, an accord so profound that its revelation would fundamentally reshape every theological understanding built upon centuries of doctrine. What pact did Eve truly make in the garden? What knowledge was she given that the patriarchal powers deemed so dangerous it required systematic erasure from human consciousness? Rachel discovered the first clue in her grandmother's belongings. A small, leather-bound journal written in a cipher that took her months to decipher. Her grandmother, a woman she had barely known, had been a scholar of apocryphal texts, a researcher whose work had been deliberately marginalized by mainstream religious institutions. The journal contained references to the Lost Covenant, fragments of ancient texts that spoke of Eve not as a temptress or a vessel of sin, but as a conscious co-creator. A being endowed with wisdom equal to Adam's, tasked with a sacred responsibility that extended far beyond the narrative of the fall. Rachel, a theologian by training but increasingly disillusioned with institutional religion, felt something stir within her. A recognition that her entire academic career had been built upon incomplete and deliberately distorted foundations. The call came not as an external summons, but as an internal awakening, a knowing that her grandmother's work had been a preparation, a torch passed through generations, waiting for her to carry it forward. She began to notice synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that seemed to guide her towards specific texts, specific scholars, specific locations where fragments of this forbidden knowledge had been preserved. It was as if the universe itself was conspiring to reveal what had been hidden, and she was merely the instrument through which this revelation would unfold. Rachel's investigation led her to connect with a secret society of scholars, predominantly women, who had been quietly preserving and studying the apocryphal texts for centuries. They called themselves the Daughters of Sophia, named after the divine wisdom principle that appeared in Gnostic and early Christian traditions. Through their archives, hidden in a monastery in the mountains of Bulgaria, Rachel encountered texts that had been carefully excised from the official biblical canon, documents that told a radically different story of human origins and purpose. She learned that Eve had been initiated into a mystery tradition before her incarnation on earth, that she had been given specific knowledge about the nature of consciousness, the structure of reality, and humanity's role in the cosmic order. She had been entrusted with a sacred covenant, a promise to guide humanity toward awakening, to preserve and transmit wisdom that would eventually lead to the full realization of human potential. Yet, as patriarchal religious structures consolidated power, this narrative was systematically rewritten. Eve became the source of sin and transgression, the temptress whose disobedience brought suffering to all humanity. The covenant was erased, replaced with narratives of female subordination and male dominion. As Rachel delved deeper, she encountered profound internal resistance. The theological training that had defined her entire identity seemed to crumble, leaving her in a state of existential vertigo. "Am I betraying my faith?" she questioned, "or am I finally discovering its true foundation?" Fear gripped her as she began to comprehend the implications of what she was uncovering, the potential to overturn not just religious doctrine, but the entire power structure that had been built upon the suppression of feminine wisdom. Externally, the resistance was more sinister. She received subtle threats. Her research was sabotaged, and she discovered that certain individuals within the highest levels of religious authority were actively working to suppress her findings. She experienced the loss of her academic position, the fracturing of her family relationships, and the profound isolation that came from pursuing a truth that the institutional world refused to acknowledge. The revelations were dangerous, not just to her career, but to her psychological stability, forcing her to question the very foundations of reality itself. The breakthrough came during a pilgrimage to Mount Athos, a place so steeped in spiritual tradition that the veil between dimensions seemed almost permeable. Rachel had been granted access to a hidden library, a sanctuary maintained by monks who had preserved knowledge that the official church had deemed heretical. In the deepest chamber, she discovered a manuscript written in Eve's own hand, or so it appeared, a text that seemed to exist outside of ordinary time. As she read the words, her consciousness began to expand, and she was drawn into a direct communion with the presence of Eve herself, not as a historical figure, but as an eternal principle, a consciousness that had maintained its coherence across all of human history. In this profound encounter, Rachel witnessed the true nature of the lost covenant. Eve had been given the knowledge of the tree of life, the understanding that consciousness itself was the fundamental substance of reality, and that humanity's purpose was to evolve toward the full realization of its divine nature. The fall had not been a tragedy, but a necessary descent into material existence, a voluntary limitation undertaken so that consciousness could experience itself through the lens of individual awareness. Eve had been tasked with maintaining the memory of this truth, ensuring that even as patriarchal structures sought to suppress it, the knowledge would be preserved in the hearts and minds of those sensitive enough to perceive it. The revelation was overwhelming, a complete dissolution of the narrative she had been taught. She understood that the entire history of human civilization could be reinterpreted as a struggle between those seeking to suppress the feminine principle of wisdom and those working to preserve and restore it. The impact was transformative, leaving her consciousness forever altered. If you enjoy these kinds of stories, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss any of our content. And tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to know. The intensity of this communion left Rachel in a state of profound transformation. She emerged from the library in a condition of deep integration. Her consciousness expanded to encompass dimensions of understanding previously inaccessible to her. She retreated to a small hermitage in the mountains, a place maintained by the Daughters of Sophia, where she could process the magnitude of what she had experienced. For months, she remained in contemplative silence, her mind a vast landscape where the boundaries between past and present, personal and universal, began to dissolve. The conflicts within her, the struggle between institutional faith and direct spiritual experience, slowly transformed into a higher synthesis. She understood that the suppression of the lost covenant had not been the result of malice alone, but of fear. Fear that the full realization of human potential would overturn the power structures that had been built upon human limitation and ignorance. She spoke to herself in the language of symbols and metaphor, her thoughts flowing in patterns that mirrored the sacred geometry she had encountered in the ancient texts. She began to perceive the world as a living mandala, each element interconnected, each consciousness a facet of a larger whole. Rachel emerged from her retreat with a clear understanding of her purpose. She recognized that her role was not to wage war against religious institutions or to impose her understanding upon others, but to become a living bridge between the suppressed wisdom and contemporary consciousness. She began to write, not as an academic, but as a spiritual chronicler, weaving the lost covenant into narratives that resonated with the deepest archetypes of human experience. She established a series of contemplative circles, gatherings where seekers could encounter the teachings of the lost covenant in a form adapted to their own spiritual readiness. She collaborated with the Daughters of Sophia to carefully disseminate the apocryphal texts, ensuring that the knowledge would be preserved and gradually integrated into human consciousness. Her most significant contribution was the creation of a series of rituals and practices that allowed contemporary women to access the same direct transmission of wisdom that had been available to Eve, practices that reconnected them with their own inherent divinity and creative power. She understood that the restoration of the lost covenant would not come through intellectual debate or institutional reform, but through the lived experience of women and men recognizing themselves as conscious co-creators, as beings endowed with the capacity to shape reality through the power of awareness and intention. As she continued her work, she became increasingly aware that she was not acting alone, that the presence of Eve and all the women who had preserved this knowledge across the ages continued to guide and support her efforts. She recognized that the covenant itself was actively working through human consciousness, gradually awakening humanity to its true nature and purpose. What sacred covenant lies dormant within your own being, waiting to be remembered and activated? And if you liked this story, you will definitely love the next one that's appearing on your screen. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave your like, and activate the notifications. See you in the next one.